Hey guys, and welcome back to Time Crime. Today we are continuing our family series, and today's video is again about another family. This one kind of mixes two things because while this is a family case and a case of a family, it also is technically unsolved. So mixing two of our past series today, which is kind of cool. And as you can tell by the title, we are doing the case of Susan Powell. And before I even get started into talking about this case at all, I want to give you a warning that this case is incredibly frustrating. And not only being frustrating, it is also just disturbing and sickening, the things that happen in this case. I just wanted to give a little bit of a trigger warning for the case overall. It's one of those cases that actually took me quite a few days to get through all the research for, just because it sickened me reading things that happened. But without further ado, we have a lot to get through in this case. There's a lot of different parts of this case, so I say that we just jump right in talking about Susan. So, Susan Cox, which was her maiden name, she is now more known as Susan Powell due to her marriage, but her maiden name was Susan Cox, so she was born Susan Cox on October 16th, 1981, in Alamogordo, New Mexico, to her parents Chuck and Judy Cox. And she also had a sister named Denise, who is still a very strong advocate for Susan to this day. Now, when she was younger, her family moved out of New Mexico and moved to Puyallup, Washington, and that's where she ended up being raised, and that's where most of her childhood took place. Now, people have described Susan as a very friendly and outgoing person. They said she was always extremely dependable for the people he cared about, and that if you needed something at any time, Susan would be there. They also said that she was an excellent listener. And Denise, her sister, actually described her as the most generous, kind-hearted person you could ever meet. And just some little side info about Susan: she really loved spaghetti. It was her favorite dinner, and her favorite TV show was Friends. Susan was also a Mormon. She grew up in the Mormon church, and that is a faith in her adult life. And her faith is something that she took super seriously. She did not mess around about it. It was not a casual thing for her. It was the crux of her life, essentially. She was an active member of the Mormon church, and she actually sang in the choir. She had a pretty good voice. And members of the church choir actually said that she had a beautiful soprano voice, and that when she sang, it would really lift the spirits of everyone. She also was very interested in makeup, hair, all things kind of cosmetology and beauty. So she decided that she wanted to pursue this as her career for life when she was 18 years old. And also at 18 years old is when she would meet Josh Powell. Now, Josh was 25 at this time, and he was also Mormon. They were members of the same church. That's how they met. And they went to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and they attended a religious course together, which is how they actually initially met. And they started talking even more after Josh threw a dinner party at his house for the other people attending the religious course, which was in November of the year 2000. And actually just a few days after knowing each other, not even dating or anything, Josh actually proposed to Susan, and Susan said yes, and the two were engaged. Now, this is not crazy for, well, I guess it's not really crazy in general, but especially for the LDS church. They put a big emphasis on, courting and marriage. They don't mess around about marriage. It's kind of frowned upon to get a divorce, things like that. So once they realized that they liked each other, they kind of just realized that they should get married. They were both members of the same church, why not? Now, let's get into a little bit more background about Josh Powell. Josh was not described in a nice way like Susan was by those who knew him, especially through people who only knew him through Susan and had met him through. They said that he was the polar opposite of her, and nobody really from Susan's family or friends seemed to like the way that he treated her. They didn't like the way that he acted around her. And Josh also did have a bad history with his previous relationships. So one of his ex-girlfriends, Catherine Terry Everett, said that she basically had to flee the States to break up with Josh over the phone because of the way he was acting, and she was literally scared for her life if he found her and, you know, if she broke up with him and he found her, essentially. So 6 months after their engagement, Susan and Josh ended up getting married at the LDS, which is the Latter-day Saints in Portland, Oregon Temple, on April 6, 2001. And after they initially got married, they obviously wanted to live together but didn't quite have the funds for that yet, so they ended up going to live with Josh's father, who is named Stephen, in the South Hill area, which was also near Puyallup, which was where Susan was raised. Now, in 2004, Susan and Josh made the decision to leave Josh's dad, Stephen's house, and they actually moved into their own place in West Valley City, Utah. And in 2005, they actually had their first son together named Charles Powell. And in 2007, they ended up having their second son together, Braden Powell. And just for continuity's sake, I'll be referring to Charles as Charlie because that was his nickname. One of their sons growing up, his nickname was Charlie. So around this time, Susan was still working in the cosmetology field, but she ended up leaving this career and actually started to be a broker for a Wells Fargo bank near the house. And Susan would always religiously attend church every Sunday because that was very important to her, and she would take Charlie and Braden with her. And it's said that she often would beg Josh to go with them because she really cared about this and she felt that he should too. However, Josh always refused to go with her. He never went with her. Even though the boys were going to, he would just stay home. And at one point in their marriage between Susan and Josh, things started to go a little downhill. They started to have some more strains and kind of problems within the relationship. Denise said that Susan was super loyal and faithful to Josh. She was so committed to her family and just wanted Josh and her sons to be happy. That's all she wanted at the end of the day. Even if she felt miserable or upset about something, she would never let it show or let it get to her in the way that it would affect her family. And this is proven because one time Josh just offhandedly had said that he wanted to get into real estate, and she actually ended up getting her real estate license just so that she could help him out, and because she thought this was something that he wanted to do. So that just shows how much commitment she had and how much she listens to people and cared about what they cared. She wasn't even interested in real estate, but she did it for him. And it's possible that this loyalty and kind of never getting it reciprocated, never feeling it in return from Josh, did start to put a bit of a strain on their marriage and their relationship. According to Susan's friends, for many years, their marriage was in complete turmoil. It was not going well. And at one point, Susan actually was speaking with a divorce lawyer over a possible divorce. And apparently it had gotten so bad that Josh didn't even touch her. According to her friends, Susan would complain because Josh did not touch her in any way. And I'm not talking just like intimacy or kissing or anything like that. Like, he just would not even like use his hands to touch her. Now, one of the other problems that seems to be kind of the catalyst for these problems was that Josh was actually in between jobs, which meant that Susan was the main breadwinner and the primary source of income. And Josh seems to have no problem spending all of the money that they had on whatever he wanted, instead of being smart about their money and either saving it or putting it towards, you know, their sons or bills, things like that. He would use it to buy whatever he wanted and whatever he felt like buying at the time. And keep in mind, this is Susan's money. Susan is making this money from her job to support her family while he's just out spending it all instead of looking for a job to help support his family as well. It actually got so bad that Josh actually had to file for bankruptcy in 2007 after he was found to have over $200,000 in debt that he owed. And that brings us to the summer of 2008, when things started to really reach their boiling. They were constantly fighting, even arguing in front of the kids, which was something that they had avoided doing before because Susan really was such a good mother. She really cared so much about her boys, and she never wanted them to be concerned or to have to listen to that kind of talk and rhetoric. So She tried not to argue in front of them, but since they were fighting literally constantly, her and Josh, a lot of times the boys would hear these arguments. And Josh would just try to exhibit control over Susan pretty much every chance he got. He always wanted to make it seem like he controlled her. And he ended up selling one of their cars so that she couldn't go anywhere without him also going. He controlled everything that she bought. It was said that she actually had to get approval from him before buying anything, which again is crazy because it was her money. She shouldn't have to get his approval to spend her money. And even though Susan was heavily contemplating leaving, and it seemed like really the only option at this point, she was not a quitter, and she did not want to give up or feel like she was quitting the marriage before giving it a fair shot. And she thought to herself, you know, at one point this was the man that she truly loved, and he was good to her at one point, and she really believed that she could get it back to that point. And she was also just afraid to leave. He had already exhibited so much control over her, and she was a victim. And she was worried that if they got divorced, that he would take their sons and that she would never be able to see them again, because this is something that he had threatened to do when she had brought up the time before. So with all of that background information, that brings us to December 6th, 2009. It was a Sunday, and Susan took her boys to church as usual, as she did every Sunday. Josh did not attend. And after church, Susan and the boys went home and ate some pancakes that Josh had made for them for when they came home. And Susan invited a neighbor over later that day just to talk to them for a little while, and she apparently had like a ball of yarn in her house and she needed help untangling it. And so she just invited her neighbor over just so that they could talk and catch up and just untangle this ball of yarn kind of while they're talking. And this neighbor would actually be the last person besides the boys and Josh to see her alive. And during this encounter with the neighbor, she had told the neighbor that she reportedly didn't feel well, which the neighbor kind of just was like, oh, you must just have eaten something bad or something, you know, you could just take some medicine. But I do think that's important to note that she said that. So the next day, December 7th, 2009, was a Monday, and Josh's employers noticed that he never showed up for work. Then Susan's employer noticed that she never showed up for work either. And in addition to this, Braden and Charlie never got dropped off at daycare, which they did, you know, every weekday. So Josh's sister Jennifer got word about this and decided to call one of Susan's close friends and ask if she had seen any of them or knew where they were or what was going on. And this ended up really panicking Susan's friend, and she said that she hadn't heard from her and she knew nothing about this. Josh's mother was also notified by his sister at this time, and she got so panicked that she actually ended up calling the police so that Jessica could do a wellness check and make sure that everything was going okay at the house. Maybe it was nothing, but they just wanted to make sure. So police went in to do their wellness check at around 10 a.m. for the Powell family. And after they got no response from knocking and ringing on the doorbell several times, they decided to just break into the house and get into the house to make sure everything was okay. And they said that they still saw all of Susan's belongings on, you know, the table and saw no signs of forced entry into the house. They also noticed that there were 2 fans blowing at some kind of wet spot on the carpet, and there was blood found on the tile, which they later found belonged to Susan. In addition, they also noticed a couch in the living room that looked like it had been very recently cleaned. You know, when you get a couch wet and it's drying and it takes a while to dry, they could tell that it had been recently wet or cleaned. And at around 5 p.m., as they're investigating this whole thing and they're really confused about what could have happened, Josh just strolls up to the house, pulls into the driveway with his 2 kids, but Susan was not in the car with them. And when everybody was like, where have you been? Why haven't you been texting anybody back, calling anybody back? Like, what's going on? He said that he had spontaneously decided to take the boys on a camping trip in the middle of the night. And he said that Susan didn't want to go, so she just stayed home. Now, this explanation is already weird, like, let's just be honest. But what was even weirder is that it was the middle of December, and West Valley City, Utah, was actually in the middle of a blizzard that night. They had a blizzard that night. So it's kind of like, who goes camping in those conditions? That's not like good weather for camping, you know. Now, when investigators looked through Josh's car, they actually did find Susan's phone, but the SIM card in her phone had been taken out. And in addition to Susan's phone, in his car they found shovels, tarps, gas canisters, and a generator. And investigators also noticed that Josh had no emotion when being told that his wife was missing at all. Because as far as he's concerned, his wife stayed at the house while him and the boys went on this camping trip. So then being told that she was not at this house and nobody had seen her or knew where she went, that would be a little bit concerning. However, he just seemed nonchalant about it, you know, didn't really seem to have much emotion about it at all. And when talking to friends of Susan's and when Susan's friends got wind what Josh's story was about what happened that night and to Susan, they did not understand Josh's story at all. Susan was a good mother, as I recently stated, and would never let her boys go on a camping trip without her so that she could make sure that they were safe. Especially because it was in the middle of winter. She never would have let them go camping in the first place in those kind of conditions. Also, when asked for specific details about the day that his wife had gone missing, Josh claims that he couldn't really remember any events leading up to her disappearance at all. So investigators end up going to check the bank that Susan worked at, and they discovered a safe deposit box that belongs to her and was in her name. And inside of the box, they ended up finding a handwritten will and testament. So the will stated how bad her marriage to Josh had gotten over the years, and that she was actually kind of concerned for her safety and worried because Josh had recently taken out a $1 million life insurance policy on her. And she went on to state in this that she wanted to divorce him, but that he had threatened that if she ever did, he would leave the country with her boys and that he would end up suing her. And the note also stated something really interesting, which was that she said, if something happens to me, it might not be an accident, which is very strong thing to say, especially in your will and testament if you think somebody's going to be able to find that. Now, about a week after she went missing, Josh was declared an official person of interest by the police, but was never made an official suspect. And then 10 days after Susan had disappeared, Josh ended up filing paperwork to withdraw money from her retirement account. And this struck investigators as pretty weird because she was only missing. She was not considered dead by this point. They didn't even feel like they were looking for a body at this point. So why would you try to take money from her account if she would be coming back? Something else that's interesting is while the entire community, including both Susan and Josh's families, were out looking for Susan and trying to raise awareness about her and asking anybody if they'd seen her, Josh didn't participate in any of this. He didn't help with the search efforts to find his wife at all. And investigators actually also ended up questioning Charlie, who was the older of the two boys, but he was still only 4 at this time. And he was actually able to give some pretty relevant information to investigators. He corroborated what his dad said, that they had gone camping that night. However, he said that his mom had gone with them, which goes against what Josh was saying, that she did not want to go and she'd stay at home. And he said that Charlie said that when they came back from camping, that his mom was not with them. He went on to say that my mom stayed at Dinosaur National Park. My mom stayed where the crystals are.
Where were you camping at?
I was camping at Dinosaur National Park.
Dinosaur Park?
No, Dinosaur National Park.
Dinosaur National Park. Who were you camping with?
My dad and my mom and my little brother.
Dad, your mom, and your brother?
Yeah.
Okay, so Charlie, when you guys came home from camping, who came home with you?
My dad
And
my mom stayed at Dinosaur National Park.
your mom stayed there?
Yeah.
How do you know your mom stayed?
Because I was coming.
Because you were coming.
Yeah.
So your mom stayed at the park.
Yeah.
Where did she stay at the park? Do you know where?
She stayed at Dinosaur National Park.
Do you know where at the park? No?
No. My mom stayed where a crystals are.
Where what are?
Where a crystals are.
The crystals? Crystals?
So a lot of people, obviously after seeing this, took this to mean that Susan's life was most likely ended in this national park that they went camping at. However, Charlie did make a few statements that were clearly false. I mean, he's 4 years old. He said that they took an airplane to the camping park, so they weren't really able to use anything that he said as fact or really ask too many specific questions, just because he obviously didn't really know what was happening. And by this point, Susan has been missing for a month, and Josh actually ended up moving him and his 2 boys back into his father Steven's house. And he said that he did this to escape media attention that was on him from West Valley City, and that he just wanted kind of the circus in the media to go away and he could just focus, he said, on finding his wife. And can I just mention that the way that Steven, Josh's father, talks about Susan is just disgusting and sickening. He clearly was interested in her in a way that was way more than a daughter-in-law, and he was inappropriate in the way that he talked about her. And Susan had actually confided in a couple of her friends that one of the reasons that they moved to West Valley City, Utah in the first place after living with Steven was so that she could get away from him because he made her that uncomfortable. She stated he was foul and disgusting, and she said that she thought that he was in love with her. In interviews with Steven, the way he talks about her even to this day is just so weird and not the way someone would talk about their daughter-in-law who went missing. Investigators, when looking at Steven for just, searching through his stuff to corroborate his stories and everything, found that he had 4,500 images of Susan on his computer, and all of them were taken without her knowledge. It's not like she was smiling in the photos. It was not like he took the photos of her consentingly. They were definitely sneakily taken photos. Not to mention, they found home videos that were made by Steven, just following her around, documenting her, talking about how much he thought she was pretty and cared about her and liked her.
He would be inside of his van and video her walking to and from buildings.
I had to get a picture of this dress. She was so beautiful.
Steven was obsessed with her. Steven had journals about her. Steven had pictures of her. Steven morphed pictures of himself with her.
And Susan had actually come to Josh with worries about his dad before and said that she was disturbed by the things that his dad was saying. And Josh literally looked at her and just said, well, that's my dad. Like, what you gonna do? That's just what my dad does, is be super creepy and predatory towards my girlfriends. I mean, I don't get it. Luckily, Susan Powell was actually arrested later for charges of voyeurism and possession of child porn. He ended up being sentenced to 7 years in prison and actually ended up passing away from natural causes 1 year after his sentence, or 1 year after his release, I'm sorry. And the Salt Lake County DA, with their investigation of Susan's disappearance, refused to file charges until they had found Susan's body. And 1 year later, in 2010, they actually ended up interviewing Charlie again to see if his timeline stayed the same, to see if he maybe remembered anything a little bit better. And this time his response was really interesting to their questions, because he just said, "We can't talk about mom or camping. I always keep things as secrets," which sounds very much like his dad told him not to say anything to investigators if asked. And after Steven got arrested, Josh ended up losing full custody of his 2 sons because they were worried about that family, and also since Josh was being investigated for a different crime, they ended up taking Charlie and Braden away. He was given only weekly supervised visits, and Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy, were granted temporary custody, so they were mostly the caretakers for the most part. And they basically acted as foster parents until they would be legally allowed to adopt and their paperwork went through. And as far as the search efforts, as recently as last year, they are still searching for remains in where they believe Susan Powell might have vanished from. But the remains that they have found, because they have found some remains, have unfortunately found to be non-human. There was a really close thing last year where they really thought that they had found Susan, and unfortunately it was not human bones. So that was pretty disheartening. And I wish that was kind of where the story ended. I mean, I don't, because it's still sad, but this story gets even sadder and unfortunately does not have a happy ending for any of the people involved in it. So on February 5th, 2012, it was one of Josh's supervised visits, one of his weekly supervised visits, and he ended up, you know, getting the boys into his house, and like the social worker usually comes after and then they all just kind of go into his house. But he was able to get the boys into the house quickly enough and then shut the door on the social worker before the social worker came by. So her name was Elizabeth Griffin Hall. That was the social worker assigned to the case that day. And she realized that she couldn't come in, and he had locked the door, so she wasn't able to come in at all. So Elizabeth, of course, started banging on the door, and she started frantically calling 911. She had a really bad feeling, and she, on the 911 call, she says that she can smell gasoline inside of the house as well as hear one of the boys crying. So she obviously knew that there was something wrong. And this is so frustrating, but the 911 caller basically blew her off and said that they needed to respond to life-threatening emergencies. And when she said that this could be life-threatening for these boys, they just blew her off again.
Something really weird has happened. The kids went into the house and the parent will not let me in the door. What should I do?
The call lasts 7 minutes. The operator asking her name, the color of her car, ignoring her urgency.
But I think I need help right away, and this is the craziest thing. He looked right at me and closed the door. Are you there? I smell gasoline and he won't let me in.
In a by-the-book approach, she's told officers can't respond immediately.
Ma'am, they have to respond to emergency, life-threatening situations first.
Well, this could be life-threatening. I'm afraid for their lives.
Who knows if the kids could have been saved that day had the 911 dispatcher taken Elizabeth's plea serious. Then, after Elizabeth was still trying to get a hold of 911, she watched as the entire house exploded and engulfed in flames. After that, obviously more 911 calls started coming in, and that is when 911 started to actually take it seriously and decided to get police and paramedics to the scene of the crime. But by that point, it was way too late. It was found that Josh had sent an email to his attorneys, actually, moments before the explosion had happened, which just read, "I'm sorry, goodbye." And the autopsies, this is so devastating, but the autopsies later found that while Elizabeth was crying out for help on the phone to the 911 dispatcher, begging the 911 dispatcher to take her seriously, Josh was taking a hatchet and bashing in his son's heads. Autopsies did later reveal, however, that Josh, as well as the boys, had all died of carbon monoxide poisoning from the fire. But that's even more traumatic because it means that the boys were actually still alive when they watched their dad explode the house and set the house on fire. So after this horrific crime took place, police really wanted answers more than ever about what happened to Susan, and they knew it would be harder now because the one person of interest that they had in the case wasn't there anymore. So they started to do a little bit more digging into Josh's family, especially after they saw, what happened with Stephen and Susan was weird. And his brother Michael kind of raised some red flags to them. They weren't very clear about why, but they started to become a little bit suspicious of them. And they felt like he might have either known what happened to Susan or had something to do with what happened to Susan. However, before they were really able to fully investigate him or question him or really do anything with him, he actually ended up taking his own life, and they were never able to get answers from him either. And after what happened to the boys, Chuck and Judy, which are Susan's parents, wanted to get some sort of justice, even if Josh was too much of a coward to the punishment himself. They ended up suing the Washington State Department of Social and Health Services in a civil court. And they said that it was their direct negligence that caused the death of their two grandsons. And this lawsuit was actually thrown out in 2015, but they were able to appeal it and tried in 2019. And they actually did end up winning this time when they were tried again in 2019. And they got a lot of money. They got about $38.5 million per child, which is great. I'm glad that they won, but I mean, it doesn't make up for anything that happens to the family at all. And still to this day, not knowing what happened to Susan, not finding her remains, they just want closure at the end of the day. They just want to know what happened to her so that they can lay her to rest. Another good thing that Susan's parents have been able to do since all of this happened was establish the Susan Powell Foundation, which was established in 2019 to assist families whose loved ones are missing and to help support domestic violence prevention efforts. So Susan is still considered missing to this day. So if you have any information about what happened to her or her whereabouts, please contact 801-840-4000. In this year, December 2023, it will have been 14 years since she went missing, and she would actually still only be 41 right now. She would still be pretty young in the grand scheme of things. She would still have an entire life ahead of her. And there is also a Facebook page called Find Susan Powell where they post updates and they talk about the case. So I will have that linked down below as well. And it's so important to share cases like this and get Susan's story out there to help as many others as possible. And one of the saddest parts of this case for me is that in the will they had initially found in Susan's safety deposit box, she stated that she wanted her children protected at any costs, and that if something were to happen to her, that they should under no circumstances go to Josh, but to her parents. And her last wish was just that her boys would be okay and could go on and live their lives, but that didn't even end up happening, as we know. Josh just is pure evil. That's the best way I can describe him. And I hope wherever he is and, you know, whatever you believe, I just hope that he is rotting or suffering. I just don't understand if he felt guilty because he had done something to Susan, why couldn't he just take his own life? And that sounds bad, but why did he have to be selfish and take his children with him? His children did nothing. His children had nothing to do with any of that. So I don't know. That is essentially the Susan Powell case. Let me know what you guys think of this case, although I'm pretty sure I already know how people feel about this case. It's pretty cut and dry. And like I said, check out the links in the description box for the Facebook page, as well as the links to like the foundation. And yeah, if you guys liked hearing me talk about this case, please do consider giving it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my true crime channel. It really helps a lot. And we'll still be continuing with this family series for I think like 3 more videos, so get excited about that. I've got some really interesting cases coming up, and something about when family is involved in cases, it just makes it so much more, I guess, personal and real, and sometimes they're just so deep and kind of horrific. So yeah, just be understanding if it takes me a little longer to get some of these videos out because there is so much. But like I said, I hope you guys enjoy hearing me talk about this case, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye guys.